So thanks for coming to class today. Hope everybody's doing well. Since we're getting closer to the end than the beginning, which you may have noticed in my most recent announcement, everybody's starting to ask about their grades. It's like, did you not know you had grades before? But now I get it. Now is when it matters a little bit more. So I put an announcement in that kind of tells you how you get whatever grade you get. Um, and I wanted to remind you of where things are in the syllabus in case you need to go back and check this stuff a little more carefully. Um, I mean, even if this is your first college class, hopefully you figured out that we tend to put all of the important stuff in the syllabus. And there are reasons for that, of course. We want to make sure that the stuff we say at the beginning of class is still true at the end of class, and that we're all on the same page as far as class procedures. And it's why the syllabus is such an important part of your college class. And we want to make sure we all, have the same rules for every student, that kind of thing. So let's look over the grade part so you can peek at that. Sorry, there'll be a lot of coughing today. I don't know if it's just a good allergy day or what for me. We'll go with that. All right, so a couple things we want to talk about in the syllabus. 1, grades. 2, book review. Okay, so syllabus is not huge, I guess. Well, maybe, I don't know. You can decide if it's huge or not. But on page 2 of the syllabus, kind of pulled over from page 1 and then on to page 2, there's a discussion of grades, the grading system. So let's look at that. The assignments, they'll be available on the Blackboard assignment page. You've probably noticed that. See the due dates on the calendar. We're going to scroll past that here in a minute. Each unit has weekly assignments worth 10 points each, so 10 points per chapter. And then you have a quiz at the end of that unit that's worth 40 points. So 2 of the units are worth 70 points. 2 of the units are worth 80 points. That gets us to a total of 300 points, okay? Which I've mentioned here a few times. The book review is a requirement. If you want an A, that could add an additional 20 points to your grade, okay? So that's not figured into the 300 points. So those are kind of bonus-ish points. And then there might have been an extra credit assignment, and those points also are just added to your total. They're not a percentage of it or anything like that. So to get an A, you have to have at least 270 points and a book review with a passing grade that's accepted. And accepted just means 1 point. It doesn't even mean like you have to have 14 out of 20. It just means you have to have 1 point. I don't think I've ever given anybody 1 point on a book review. I have given people like 5 or 6, but there are reasons for that. I can justify it, but so 270 plus a book review is an A. You have 270 without the book review, you're getting a B. That's just the way it goes. Don't give me a hard time. You know this ahead of time. You got to write a book review. It's a writing requirement for a class, so just do it. Just do it. Okay, 240 to 269 is a B. 210 to 239 is a C. And then 180, anything below a C, you don't care anyway. You can turn in a couple of things late, a weekly assignment or 2. I didn't really intend for you to consider all 4 weekly questions as one assignment, but apparently some of you do. I prefer you didn't. But I'm going to try not to be like a super jerk about any of that stuff because I realize we all have things to do. That's why I'm also encouraging you to turn stuff in weekly if you can, recognizing I may not be grading stuff. How many book reviews? You only do 1, and we'll talk about the book review here in a minute, okay? All right. Let me know if you're running late on some stuff, and if I forget, feel free to remind me because I'd rather you remind me of stuff. Also, When you take the quiz, if you notice there's something wrong with the quiz, could you tell me before the end of the grading period instead of after? So like as soon as you notice it, send me an email, okay? Because last time, I guess in a couple of classes, there was one question that appeared and didn't really have a question. It had an answer, so I guess it got shuffled in a funny way. And you know, if I know that, I can probably fix it. But if I don't know it, I can't. And it also will tell me if it's just a problem with one or two people. It might be, you know, how your technology received the quiz. If it's a problem that's pretty widely experienced, then it'll tell me that it's probably a problem with how I entered the quiz, okay? You have to have a book review to get an A. I don't know how many times I can tell you that. There's still going to be some of you that have your 270 points at the end, but no book review, and you're going to be upset because you got to be, that you got to do a book review, okay? If you want an A, you just have to do it. Just do it, okay? Or don't. You don't have to do it. You just have to do it if you want an A, okay? If you don't ask me ahead of time, if your book is okay, then I technically can say like, nope, I'm not grading that, no good. And if you plagiarize, you are gonna get a bad grade. You're gonna fail the entire class, not just the book review. So please, 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 please not plagiarize. Even if it's just a paragraph. I only stole a paragraph of someone else's work. Don't steal any of anyone else's work. I am not suggesting to you that you can't occasionally quote somebody. If you're going to quote them and tell me that you quoted them. You just have to, document that you quoted them. And I'm even asking you in the book review to quote from time to time. So completely legitimate as long as you tell me that you're doing it, okay? All right, you are supposed to attend, by the way. I mentioned that before, but most of you guys do, that's why you're here. All right, scrolling down to the calendar. Because I have a lot of people ask me like, how are we supposed to know when stuff's due? I don't know, I thought I put a calendar in there. Also, it usually says on the assignment, you know, so. That Friday, the 11th of due dates, that is right before the class ends. So if you're thinking, I think I'll turn in my weekly questions late there, you better not turn them in too late because I have to have time to grade them, okay? So don't be very late if you're gonna be late on those last questions because my grades will be due that Tuesday. So you know what I'm saying? And I'll send out probably a stronger statement after I've graded all the stuff from this unit, and I'll say like, look, I'm not accepting work after this day and this time. So you got to hold fast to that because otherwise I'm not going to get stuff done. And this isn't, for those of you new to this isn't like a high school class where, you know, next semester you go like, you know, I really wanted to pass. I should have done that extra assignment. So I'm going to send it to her and see if she'll add it. No, okay? So do the stuff when you're supposed to do it. You have the 4 weekly questions from this unit, and then you have 3 from unit 4. So there's 4 due on Friday, and then there'll be 3 due on the 11th of December. And all of those questions, I think, are in the course documents page already. And maybe I'll have time on Wednesday. I don't know, I got some stuff, but maybe I'll have time on Wednesday to add the weekly questions for the last unit into the assignment section. Okay. Also, there's still some of you that I know aren't using your book at all, and you just go, you write some answers that sound like you're gossiping. Like, I heard this and I saw that and it was on Instagram or something. Look stuff up in the textbook. And if you don't have the textbook, I know that on the syllabus that link doesn't work anymore. But I sent you an announcement link where you can look at the whole book online. I know some of you go, no, the trial's only for 2 weeks. I know the trial's only for 2 weeks. But the other link had the PDF. Also, those of you like the trial's only 2 weeks, you haven't used your book yet, go get the 2-week trial for the next 2 weeks. Don't be like that, okay? Use the textbook and stop just Googling stuff. Come on, stop it. Yeah. Whilst and amongst. I don't know. You guys have all gone British on me. Although I know some of you actually are British. Whilst and amongst. I've read that a lot lately. But we talked about that before. It's okay. Just a reminder of when stuff's done again. Unit 1 was due on the 18th, so it's middle of each month. Unit 2 is due on the 16th of October. Unit 3 is due this Friday, the 13th of, Friday the 13th of November. Book review due on a Monday after Thanksgiving. And Friday, 12/11 is your Unit 4 stuff. Unit 4 stuff. Okay. So really, if you look at the calendar and the grade section, it really does tell you everything you need to know. Because I've had people like, I don't understand the breakdown between the weekly questions and the quizzes. It's like 40 points for the quiz, 10 points for each weekly question. Here it tells you how much each unit is worth. I think I've been fairly clear about this, but I also recognize that some of you forget that this is in the syllabus. It's also why we go over the syllabus the first day of class, but I also recognize first day of class was a long time ago. Had somebody in the last class say, well, I don't even know where the book review assignment is. Hey, here it is, attached to the syllabus. Imagine that. And they said, but you didn't give us that list of books. Also in the syllabus, strangely enough. So just gentle reminder about the book review, because I've also had people say, well, there's no format. I go, yeah, there's kind of a format there. So I'll just remind you, your format's listed here where it says form. So 1,500 words, which is like 4 to 5 pages. I really could care less what type of font you use, size of font. I would love it if you would put a word count on there. That would be useful to me. And that's why it says, please include a word count at the end of your submission. You put it at the beginning, I won't care. Just put it in there somewhere. And remember, it's a book review, not a book report. So you're not just telling me everything that was in the book. That's a book report. You're doing exactly what I asked you to do in these 3 parts. And you can even say, your English teacher would not like it, but you can even say like part 1 and then do the stuff. And then part 2 and then the stuff. I don't care, I just want this stuff. So part 1, I'm thinking it's about a page long. And this is where you tell me what's in the book. This is the book report part of the book review, but it's also clearly really short. So I'm thinking about a page long. It's a little more than the table of contents, quite a bit less than the book review. So maybe you talk about, in the first third of the book, the author talks about the main subject's childhood, and then you tell me something briefly about the childhood. And then you say the second third of the book, they talk about his college years and early career, and then you tell me something about that. And then third section of the book is where they talk about his very public career and when he becomes famous, and tell me some stuff about that. But this part's supposed to be fairly short. So 1 page, maybe a page and a half, but it needs to be shorter than part 2 and 3, okay? Part 2 and 3, I'm thinking page and a half, 2 pages each. So the longer part of the book review. Excuse me. And this is where you do what I ask you to do. Part 2, tell me why the author wrote the book. So this is where you talk about the author's thesis. If you have no idea what the author's thesis is, we got a couple problems. 1, maybe you picked the wrong book. 2, maybe you didn't read it carefully enough. Typically, in the foreword of the book, they tell you why they wrote the book. That's their thesis. So the reason they wrote the book, why they wrote the book. Sometimes the author just says, this is my thesis. That's a really good clue. So make sure you look in the foreword part of the book, or I don't know, the dedication, sometimes it's in there, but the introductory part of the book, which a lot of times people just skip. For a history book, you probably should read it. Honestly, for most books, I don't know if it matters as much for a novel, but for a history book, for a nonfiction book, it does matter. Yeah, so look at that foreword or introduction, and they'll probably tell you what their thesis was, or at least why they wrote the book. For a biography, it's not necessarily a thesis, although sometimes it is. It might be, why did they choose that person to write an entire book about? Okay. So in this section, find their thesis, and then you go through the book and tell me parts of the book that prove the thesis. So if they said, you know, this person was prepared for the role later on, and the role later on made them one of the most important people of their era, then in the early part of the book, you're pulling out pieces of the book that prove that he was or she was prepared for the role later on. So you may talk about the importance of their education, or important things they did as a kid, or how they were different and how they stood out. So you're finding stuff through the book that you think proves the thesis. Now, if you don't think they prove the thesis, you can say that too, but you still need to pull things out from the book. I would also suggest to you that you not quote long sections of the book, like don't put in 5 paragraphs from the book, but you know, a sentence, you know, a phrase, you know, but do it more than once. I would also suggest to you that you intersperse quotes throughout your paper, and that they not all be from the same 3 pages of the book. One of the biggest concerns that I have when I see that you've quoted page 15 and page 260 is that you have not read between page 15 and page 260. So make sure you really need to read the book. And while you're reading the book, you want to, if it's a physical book, circle some stuff. If it's an online book, highlight some stuff. Or if it's a physical book, what I used to do when I did this kind of writing, because historians do this kind of writing all the time as part of our training, is Post-it notes. So I would put a Post-it note, and I would write on the Post-it note the quote that I liked, and then I would just stick it to where you could, you know, see the Post-it note, you know, from the top of the book, like a bookmark. That's what I would do, but you know, I'm old, so we do different things. Also, one of the things you could do is copy and paste a book review from the internet, but don't, because I'll notice. Every year there's one person that does that, and I just don't understand why. Because if you do that, then you get, you know, an F for the class. So don't do that, okay? And again, optional assignment, why on earth would you do this and cheat? If you're not going to do it, don't do it. Nobody's forcing you to do it, but do not plagiarize. And don't even plagiarize a little. Now, I know you're going to quote the book. I just told you to. But you're going to tell me, like, you'll have quotation marks, and then in parentheses, it'll say, like, 2. So I'll know it was from page 2. So that's legit. You going to bookreviews.net and copying a book review, not legit. Yeah. And we talked about this a little bit with especially those New Deal answers. A lot of you did a bunch of that foolishness. Don't do that, okay? Cut it out. Just put in your own words. All right. So number 2, look for the author's thesis, quote throughout the book, and make sure that you quote from several different pages interspersed throughout the book. Part 3, personal evaluation of the book. This is kind of a, what did you think about it? How does it compare with stuff you already knew? How does it compare with stuff in your textbook? That's also another section where you got to look in the book. Remember that that index is your friend, so you can look stuff up in the index and it'll help you find things. Now, if you are reading a book like, let's say that you read the Black Like Me book. That guy's not in the book, that John Howard, I think that's his name. We'll see it here in a second. But that author's not in the book, and the event of his book is not in the book. The civil rights movement is definitely in the book. So you won't compare that book necessarily to something that Foner says about that book, but to things that Foner says about the civil rights movement. See what I'm saying? So it may not be the exact same person, but you'll find an event that's pretty similar most of the time. If you don't find anything in the textbook about your event or your person, you can say that. And there's some of those books where that might be true. But typically you're going to find at least some similar event that you could. Okay, yes, the book review is due Monday, November 30th. Okay. All right, let me write down someone else is coming in. We can hear them. All right. And let's see. Third part, your value. Oh, you could also talk about if you think the author has a bias. Now, every author has a bias. No, you're good. Yeah, don't. Yeah, I'm sorry. Don't ever feel bad that you're late. Sometimes you got to do stuff. I would feel bad if I were late, but you know, this is my job, so I get it. You're good. Um, bias. Every author has a bias. You just may or may not be able to tell what it is. So, I mean, don't feel bad if you can't find one. That's cool. Sometimes, though, like it's really obvious, like you know who the author is. You could also Google the author and, you know, search and maybe where they went to school, what they did for a living, who their parents were. You know, like Woodrow Wilson writing a history of the South, which he did do, and you could read for your book review. I wouldn't if I were you. But he has a bias because he's from Georgia and his parents ran a Confederate Army hospital during the Civil War. So he's a little more pro-South than pro-North. And you could tell that if you read that book, you know, because he talks about the white South being crushed under the heel of the black South, which is an unusual bias, I'm pretty sure, for a historian. But you know, sometimes their biases won't be as obvious, or they just won't be as obvious to you, and that's fine. It really is. So don't worry so much about that, but maybe look at their background. Yeah. Okay. And then you can talk about how a book would be improved, but try to avoid things like it was boring or it was too long. Tell me, or it wasn't well written. Tell me what they could have left out, what they should have added, what you thought was less important to the reader, what you thought was more important to the reader. I know I've probably mentioned one time I had a student write about how poorly written the book was, and it had won a Pulitzer Prize. So I am not saying that your opinion doesn't matter, but probably the guys handing out the Pulitzer Prize outrank you a little. No offense. No offense. But, you know, if you don't think a book is poorly written or is well written, that's completely fine. Just tell me what you didn't like about it rather than it was boring, it was too long, it was poorly written, you know, a little more specific. And then, of course, mention would you recommend it to others, which not everybody does, and that's completely fine too. And then when I grade it, it'll either be yes or no. And if it's yes, you'll get anywhere from 1 to 20 points. If it's no, it's because you plagiarized. That's pretty much it. And I'll send you a link where I think you plagiarized from. Now, when that happens, and I've done that a few times on your weekly assignment, it's not as useful as you might think for you to say, no, I didn't plagiarize from that source. Because I will not send you the link if a portion of your work is not word for word the exact same thing. And I don't mean stuff like George Washington was the first president. I mean substantial stuff, okay? So if I send you the link and it's word for word, you may have gotten it from another source, but you didn't write it, is what I'm saying, okay? So have I said it enough? Don't plagiarize, please don't. And these have to be on time. They have to be on time, which means start working on it now, okay? I know that the Thanksgiving week is probably when you're going to work on it. I get that because that's probably when you have a lot of time unless you're in charge of cooking and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, don't leave it for the last minute or second because that's when the emergencies happen. In the old days, it's when your printer didn't work and you ran out of ink. You don't have that problem, so that's the good part. But, you know, if the electricity, I had a Zoom meeting with a group yesterday, and the person leading the Zoom meeting, their neighbor cut a power line, so they didn't have power in their house. And if his computer, if he hadn't had one charged device, he couldn't have led the Zoom meeting. So plan for an emergency. Try not to leave stuff for the last minute. I know some of you, like my little kids, don't even care about planning. I know they don't, but do your best. All right, book list. You do not have to pick from this book list at all. If you pick something else, just please let me know, and I'll probably say yes. Although to a couple of you, I've said maybe, but mostly I'll say yes, okay? Sorry. Okay, now let's say that you're in this position where it's like, oh crap, I need more points. I didn't really want to do the book review, but that's 20 more points. So maybe I should do it, but I don't really want to. It does not have to be a topic you've covered in class. It has to be something after the Civil War that has to do with the United States, okay? So anything that has to do with the United States of historical significance that happens after the Civil War. Pre-Civil War is for the other class, the 1301 class, okay? Because yeah, I had somebody that asked if they could write about Thomas Jefferson or something like, no, sorry, save that for later or earlier, technically. All right, but let's say that you're in this desperate spot. It's like, oh crap, I gotta read a book, but I don't know which one to read. And yeah, here's my advice on what to read if you're in the desperate spot. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Any historical event after the Civil War. Yep, okay. So I'm gonna pick short stuff or stuff that is relatively easy to read, but is still worth, you know, a college paper. Okay, and I'm gonna tell you there are problems with each of these books, but they're short, okay? John Howard Griffin, I can never remember his last name. Black Like Meat. I'm gonna tell you up front the problems with this book. I've talked to you about it before. It's a weird book, and it is clearly some cultural appropriation. I get it, I do. But it's still a weird book and that's something you could talk about, you know, in that third section of the book. But this is a guy who is a newspaper reporter. He writes for a newspaper that has primarily Black audience. He's a white guy. His goal is to write about how Blacks and whites treat each other when nobody's looking. And he's trying to interview folks, and he feels like he's not getting anything close to the truth. So he decides the only way he can find this out as a white reporter is to pretend to be a Black guy. So he goes undercover as a Black guy and writes about his experience. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, like, why didn't they just listen to what Black guy said? That's an interesting question you could discuss. There certainly were African-American journalists who would say, hey, this is how we're treated, this is wrong. I mean, we, as a country, this is around 1960. Not like we didn't know stuff, but Griffin is going to give like a day-to-day account from a white guy perspective, which, for better or worse, is going to influence people in a different way. What he ends up doing after he publishes the articles, which turn into a book, as he moves out of the country because people threaten to kill him, it's interesting, weird, problematic, historically. I mean, it's true. I don't know that it's accurate. Accurate and true are not necessarily the same thing, but it also, it goes quickly. Like, you'll read through it really quickly because it's weird and it's relatively short. And he writes like a journalist. So yeah, okay. So you can read that if you want. It's kind of weird, but it's short. And the only thing I'm recommending today are things that are short. This one, Gerda Weissman Klein, All But My Life, a little tricky because it starts, as a little bit of it is a Holocaust memoir. She was in concentration camp that was freed by US soldiers, and she ends up marrying one of those soldiers. But it talks about that era, talks about her life in the United States. Yeah. So, I mean, and it also goes quickly because of the kind of story that it is. So it would give you some World War II-ish stuff to talk about, some prejudice stuff to talk about. There's a lot of, I mean, it's not as strong historically in some ways as some of the other books, but that's always for the people that want to read about that time period and seem to want to read about the Holocaust. That's usually the best I can do for you, because we need a US connection, and there you have two. Weird Story if you like boxing. Also short book, Ghosts of Manila. This is written by a sports writer. I think he worked for Sports Illustrated. And it's really a chronicle of the lives of Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, and the 3 Ali Frazier fights. and really how the public is divided over their fights. And it's kind of a division of pro-Vietnam versus anti-Vietnam. And it's weird because you got a bunch of racist folks from the South who are cheering for a black guy, Joe Frazier in this instance. It also brings in the difficulties of the Nation of Islam. Muhammad Ali was converted by Malcolm X, and then Malcolm X did some things that upset the Nation of Islam, and then he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam. So that kind of made Muhammad Ali perhaps tread a little lightly with the new leaders, you know, not Malcolm X, but the other folks who talked to him, because at that point Malcolm X was gone. So this is a complicated mix of politics, history, and through sports. And it goes quickly as well because it's short. And then the other one that I have that people read sometimes when they're, you know, it's last minute-ish, super depressing, Linda Van Devanter, Home Before Morning, Story of an Army Nurse. It's exactly what it says it is. And at the beginning of the war, she's very pro-USA, go team, we're gonna stop communists over there before they come over here. You know, party line kind of thing for Vietnam, which most people were in the early part of that conflict. And then as time goes along, she sees kind of the hopelessness, what she determines to be maybe pointlessness of the war. Her life, her personal life really falls apart. It's incredibly depressing, but it also is not an atypical story of someone who's involved in the conflict for a long time. So, and certainly I mean, I have 3 uncles who fought in Vietnam, and none of them would agree with her assessment of the war at all. None of them, but her assessment of the war is not unusual. So, but it's really depressing. It is. But those three or four, I can't even remember, those 4. Black Like Me, All But My Life, Ghost of Manila, and Home Before Morning, they read pretty quickly, is why I told you those. You don't have to pick those. You don't have to pick anything on this list. If you pick something different, however, you have to receive my approval first. You just got to tell me. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I just don't want you to waste your time, okay? And at this point, if you haven't picked a book, unless you read really fast, I'd probably go for something a little shorter than longer. Just a thought. All right, and here's the rubric, how I'll grade it. 4 out of the 16 points are how well it's written, and then 4 and 6 points for each section, depending on how long the section is, okay? All right, that's it. You guys have any questions about your grades or book review before we go on with the subject matter of the day? Oh, goodness. Any questions? All right, Colton seems to be giving me the thumbs up, but my guess is that's always happening because that's the picture. All right, if you have questions about any of that stuff, you can always email or you can check the syllabus. Yes, the syllabus. All right, let me share the notes for today. I think that's all I wanted to go over. I think so. All right. Oh, one of you typed in something. Let me check. Finger guns out. All right. Hey, is that a tech thing? No, that's guns up. I didn't go to tech. Did I even go to college? Yeah, I did go to college. Of course I did. They wouldn't hire me if I didn't have a degree. What the heck? All right. So here we go. The 60s, probably the most important decade in the history of the United States. Why would I say that? Yes, because I was born in the 1960s. So the world changed because of what happened in the 1960s. I was like UT. What happens here changes the world. Yeah, okay. But the 60s is full of stuff. I mean, you know, not just my birth or 2/3 of my brothers. But lots of other stuff like a civil rights movement. We still got the Cold War, you got the Vietnam conflict, you got the war on poverty. You got a little bit of government corruption. When is there not a little bit of government corruption? But this will be a fairly extensive scale of that, which will lead us to strongly distrust politicians, which is a hallmark of people from my era. Yes, it is. And I will try to share that belief with all of you. I'll try not to. It would be not, okay, never mind. All right, 60s. Okay. We'll talk about the civil rights movement. I know you're aware of the civil rights movement. We've already started to talk about it. Oh, and your weekly question is for this week, where was freedom, liberty, that kind of stuff expanded in the 60s or not? It's something along those lines. So you can kind of assess that a little more next time. But you know, this is another one of those questions where the answer is yes and the answer is no. So I would make sure that I discuss both sides of this because, you know, in an argument paper, even if you feel like liberty was expanded more than it wasn't, you can't ignore things that disprove your point, okay? All right, because it's not like you're arguing with your little brother. You know, you're trying to make an academic point here, so you can't ignore some of the facts. All right, so civil rights movement really starts out nonviolent. It's going to change over time with an addition of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you're going like, they say they're nonviolent. They are. They're just less patient. And then you end up with some Black Panthers who are much less nonviolent. And then maybe Malcolm X, whose language, at least, his rhetoric is less nonviolent. And then, you know, the Nation of Islam, who they truly are less nonviolent, but not all of them, but the fruit of Islam is okay. All right, back to business here. So the nonviolent part, Martin Luther King Jr., Southern Christian Leadership Conference, emphasized nonviolent resistance as taught by Gandhi, Reinhold Niebuhr, and then the training by our friend Bayard Rustin, who we talked about a little bit last time. Who does the civil rights camps essentially in the summer to train you how to behave when you're beaten, how to roll up into a ball, how to resist, you know, calling names and lashing out at people who lash out at you. And remember that he's more of a behind the scenes guy because he's an openly gay guy, which is not cool in the 50s or the 60s, to be fair. I know you're going like, you know, wasn't there a gay liberation movement during this time period? Yeah, there was. It works a little better on the coast, not as well in the middle of the country, and not as well in the South, to be honest. But that's true of most changes, if that's fair for me to say. They tend to happen in more urban areas first. It's not always true, but it's usually true. All right, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is going to organize sit-ins and bus rides and that sort of stuff, which will be seen as more direct action, not necessarily less nonviolent, it's just more, you're pressing the issue more. So what these guys will do is voting rights drives, or voting registration drives, excuse me. They will do the Freedom Rides, RIDES, where, you know, at this point, honestly, buses have been integrated in 1955 with Rosa Parks, and then throughout the country, interstate bus rides have been integrated by the Supreme Court a few years after that. It's just the South, you know, at all deliberate speed, they're not paying any attention to that. So Black and white college kids would get on buses that they knew took a route from the South to, or the North to the South, and they would ride just to get arrested for being, you know, interracially, for not being segregated on the bus, even though you know, the courts had already determined that it was time to end segregation. But you know, if you follow the story of those freedom rides, you'll notice that the buses get set on fire, that there are places where the buses are stopped and the KKK, you know, beats everybody up on the bus. There's some very violent things that happen and life-threatening things that happen to people who want to integrate the buses. The sit-ins, these are lunch counter sit-ins, and I don't think we do the lunch counter thing, as we surely don't do any of that kind of stuff during the pandemic, do we? But these were places typically in department stores where you could also, they had a little cafe section, and they didn't necessarily have a lot of tables, but they had the little kitchen and then the counter. and you could sit at the counter and eat probably a sandwich or soup, you know, a small meal. And these were primarily segregated in the South. Well, the Supreme Court had already ruled that, you know, segregation, all public facilities needed to end. So these primarily college kids would go into stores with lunch counters, and they would sit next to each other, and they would demand, not in a like a I will be served, you know, not that kind of thing, but they would order, and then the employees would say, I'm sorry, I can't serve you at the counter, and they would just sit there. They just wouldn't leave, hence a sit-in. They didn't do anything violent. They weren't yelling at anybody. They weren't you know, doing things that any of us would consider terribly aggressive, but certainly in that time period, it was very assertive. What ends up happening is the people who work in those places will call the police. Since it's in the South, the police will come in and they will enforce segregation in a much less nonviolent way. Typically, people from the community would come in and beat up these people, and then the police would, after they've been beaten up, come in and arrest them and take them off to jail for disturbing the peace by getting beaten up at a lunch counter. So there's lots of video of this because the folks who did this made sure they did it at a certain time of day, that they called the news media, especially the television media, and they made sure that there was film of it. So they made sure it was covered, because if no one sees it, it doesn't happen. So Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested in Birmingham, voting rights protests, and the religious leaders in Birmingham will write an editorial blaming Martin Luther King Jr. for the violence that's come to their community. They'll tell him that, none of that stuff happened before he showed up in their town, and that if he would just leave things alone, everything would be fine. And he writes a response, which is fairly famous. It's a letter from the Birmingham jail where he says, you know, from my perspective, everything's not fine. And if you were treated the same way that I'm treated, the same way that all African Americans in the South are treated, you would have a different perspective as well. That's not what he says, but it's what he says. That video that I've encouraged you to look at, if you have time, is linked here, about 30 minutes long. It covers all of the major parts of the early civil rights movement. And I think it's worth you 30 minutes if you have it. I understand. All of our days are pretty full. So, March on Washington happens in 1963. That's organized by Bayard Rustin as well. And that culminates with the I Have a Dream speech. So you start to see some pretty important progress in the civil rights movement, but it is difficult progress, and it's progress that has a pretty high price for the people involved in the movement. They get arrested a lot, beaten a lot, people get killed, as we all know. So, but this is tough stuff. 1963, civil rights protests in more than 185 cities. I know, well, maybe I don't know. People that I talk to sometimes feel as though, you know, there's a lot of unrest right now in our country, which I would agree with. There's, you know, much more than we're kind of used to. I usually suggest to people who know me better that we have had times in our history where there was much more unrest and things were much worse. And, you know, the Civil War is clearly the obvious time. But in 1963, in 185 cities, there are these protests that end up with the police beating the crap out of the protesters, where, you know, the violence is clearly systemic. It's, you know, it's bad. There's not a whole lot of argument about who's at fault here, except in 1963, when people just said, you know, if you just stay home, you wouldn't get beaten up. There's some truth to that. However, they weren't out there, you know, to get beaten up. They were out there to make a point, but also understanding that the only way they were going to make this point was by being mistreated by the police, which is got to be a hard situation to be in. In 1968, you'll see a whole different level of chaos that occurs because you've got civil rights protests combined with Vietnam War protests combined with a whole bunch of people in poverty. So I don't know. There are times in our country where we've had a lot of unrest, and sometimes it leads to positive change, and sometimes it leads to a little bit of repression. So kind of depends on how we react to that change. Do we look at the unrest and do we say, here are the things we really need to change, and we change them, which we do from time to time? Or do we say, like, I just want it to be quiet again, so let's just put everybody in jail and try to be quiet again? And we've done that from time to time as well. So civil rights protests, though, you know, the 60s, they're a hallmark of the 60s. But the unusual goals in the early part of the civil rights, maybe unusual, is you got to get arrested and you want to make the news. Now, we really get in the modern era the making the news part. It's a lot easier, I think, to make the news now because you make your own video and post it on YouTube or Instagram or wherever people, TikTok or wherever people post things. In that era, you had to make sure you made the evening news. So they became friends with certain reporters, and you know, the more national the reporter, the better off you were. And you had to plan your events, your protests for a certain time of day, make sure the film crews were there, and they needed to be able to process the film quickly enough to get it on the evening news. So leaders of the movement really want to contrast their nonviolent methods with the police. So if you see protests from this time period, they're going to be dramatically different than, well, my opinion, I think they appear different than protests in the modern era, because you don't see anything that looks very aggressive from the protesters. They really are just literally standing there with signs, or maybe they're singing songs, and there's nobody like in the face of the police or, you know, being violent or any of that. Well, I don't want to say nobody, but it's really rare. But that was their goal. They wanted to create this enormous contrast between their peaceful methods and the violence with which they were met. So, and that's not a very 21st century thing, in my opinion. That's definitely a 60s kind of thing. You'll see that in several types of protests. Now, I've already mentioned, that's definitely not a Black Panther thing. I mean, there are certain groups who, by the end of the 60s, is like, this isn't working, let's try something different. And I think that's also what you see. I have no idea, and I don't know that any of us have a full picture of the purpose and methods of modern protesters. But I think that's a little of what you see in modern protests, that people are fed up with what they think were supposed to be institutional, peaceful channels for change, and they don't think they're working quickly enough. You'll see that by the end of the 60s with these movements. But I mean, if you go all the way back to the early 50s when this starts, these folks had a lot of patience, way more than any of us would probably have. Okay. Organizers needed to gain support from the average white person in the North, because those are people that vote and push for legislation and lobby and that sort of thing. All right, in the meantime, we also have political stuff. Excuse me. We're electing JFK. You've heard of JFK? This is where I check to see if you're still with me. JFK is John Fitzgerald Kennedy. His family was fairly famous, fairly well off. He was a World War II hero. His brother was a World War II hero who died in World War II, Joseph. That was the one they thought would be the president. JFK is a little younger, a little more sickly, gotten a little more trouble than his older brother, I think. Although they could have gotten in equal trouble. I'm not as familiar with Joseph. All right, so JFK runs for president, and he gets elected, and he promises a man on the moon by the end of the decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Have you heard the speech? He says in that speech, why does Rice play the University of Texas in football? Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's like, I don't know if people at Rice were thrilled about that, but they understand. We also thought that the Kennedy administration would be a new start for us because we had a younger president. He's got little kids, super pretty wife who's a little more international, well educated, fluent in several languages, so and stylish, and brought classical music to the White House. And we just thought it was, a renaissance of sorts. But this is not exactly the right time for a renaissance because you have a lot of social unrest. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. I want to see if you guys are with me. So tell me something, you can say it out loud or put it in the chat. Tell me something that you know about John Kennedy. Just like 2 minutes. Tell me something you know about Kennedy. Checking to see who's still with me. Teachers have to do this from time to time. Type in something, anything you know about JFK. Or say it out loud. He's based, you mean biased, maybe? I think everybody probably is. If you're thinking he's biased, do you have any thoughts about what? It's fine if you don't. He did get assassinated. Okay, 35th president. How'd you know that? More than one lady loved him. That is probably true. He had a very bad day in Dallas. It is true. LBJ's. See, you're playing along. I appreciate this. This is good. Yeah, he's the one that had Marilyn Monroe sing happy birthday to him in a not very musical way. Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracy about his assassination. Could it really have gone at a certain angle? He's the youngest elected president. He was 42, I think. Well, I know he was 42. Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was 41, but he took someone else's place from Massachusetts. He does have a desire to end segregation. Now, he's not going to push very hard for it for a couple of years, but by the third year of his presidency, he's quite a bit more serious about it. And then LBJ will say, we have to carry this out to fulfill the legacy of JFK, which is kind of fascinating too, because those two hated each other. So they really did hate each other. But I think that happens sometimes with president and vice president. I think so. All right. Anybody want to say anything else? You guys did pretty well, though. You guys should harass each other in the chat room, like talk to the people who didn't say anything. All right. Don't harass each other in the chat room. I'm sorry. I was just kidding. I'm not encouraging you to bully people in your college class. Don't do it. All right, back to the notes. Thank you for the interlude there. Thanks for paying attention. LBJ is tricky. Yeah, we're going to have a hard time with LBJ because you're not wrong. LBJ is going to say some words none of us would ever say. No, there's no doubt. And I don't mean the cuss words because I know a lot of people cuss. I'm probably the only one who doesn't. But they were super racist stuff. And it's so puzzling because LBJ is really good on civil rights, except his language is not really good on civil rights. So LBJ to me is, yeah, definitely heard of the Kennedy curse. Yeah, they struggle, in their personal lives. There's somebody always having.
For real, he was racist. Like I did an essay in him in high school, and as an African American, I was appalled. Like I was like, why am I writing this? Because
No, he says some terrible stuff, but I don't mean, but like we should excuse him because we shouldn't. But he's the force behind the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. I mean, it's just puzzling. At best, it's puzzling. Because you look at what he does for the civil rights movement and it's tremendous. But you look at what he says, also tremendous, but not in a good way. You go like, that's the most racist sounding dude I've ever heard. And you wouldn't be wrong. So LBJ is just puzzling to me. And he is, he's the guy that wants to end poverty, but he talks about people in horrible ways. And this is not, I don't know. I know we currently have a president who occasionally says inappropriate things as well. It's not unusual historically to have presidents that, but to, weird to think that LBJ could say those things at least semi-publicly, and people weren't terribly distressed about it. And yeah, no, it's rough. LBJ's rough. I mean, he just is, because it's hard to reconcile his record with his personality. To me, it is. And of course, I'm not from Texas, so that doesn't, I don't have that, he's our president, so, we got to overlook some stuff, but I don't know. But I also, will always remind anybody who studies history, yeah, no, it is tricky. Yeah, you can be a good person but say stupid stuff. It's like, yeah, that's not a good excuse. No, I get it. But, we will, if you look deeper at pretty much any president we've ever had, even ones that we really, really like, with probably the exception of, guys like Lincoln, which they really are the exception. They do some stuff in their personal lives you just look at and you go like, what the heck were you thinking? Why you like that? That sort of thing. And with LBJ, no, it's pretty extreme in a lot of ways. And the language, the racist language it's way out there, to be sure. But I mean, you look at JFK, who looks like a kinder, gentler guy, but I mean, he's having parties where they pay for prostitutes to come to the parties. And, he's having an affair with a lot of people, but, at the very least, Marilyn Monroe, while his brother is probably having an affair with Marilyn Monroe. And stuff that he's doing with interns is way worse than a president later on will get impeached for. So, I mean, there's just, but this is also the era, up until Nixon, when the press knew stuff about presidents, they covered it up to be patriotic. So, the press knew that FDR, when he went to Warm Springs, Georgia, which I was telling one of my friends when Biden gave one of his last campaign speeches at Warm Springs, Georgia, and talked about how great FDR was and how he went there for healing. It's like, that is not exactly why he went there. I mean, that's part of why he went there, but that's also where he met his girlfriend. So, yeah, behind the scenes, some of these guys, almost all the presidents have something we don't need to know, but we probably do need to know. But the press covered it up, so I feel like I scrolled the wrong way. I'm sorry. Okay, but we like Kennedy. On the surface, Kennedy is great. And I'm not even saying that you can't be a flawed person and still be great, although it is easier for us to accept the JFK flaws than the LBJ flaws. It is, because those are probably more marital flaws than, I don't know, than racist kind of stuff. All right, let's talk about JFK and foreign policy, which isn't quite as subjective. Maybe it is. Two major foreign policy events for JFK are the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both have to do with Cuba. Bay of Pigs, this was a holdover plan from the Eisenhower administration. President Eisenhower planned a revolution which he hoped would look indigenous and organic, started by the Cuban people, to overthrow Castro. Castro had taken power in Cuba in '59. So the thought was, you want to do this quickly before he's really entrenched. So the plan's drawn up in '59 or '60. It's an election year. Eisenhower passes on the plan to Kennedy, where Kennedy, of course, gets to decide if he wants to follow through on that plan or change it, and he does a little of both. We had trained about 1,500 Cuban expatriates. The CIA had trained them in Nicaragua. We were going to drop them back off. We, the United States military, I'm not part of the military, thank goodness for that. Not because of the military, which is amazing, but because I would not enhance the military in any way. However, now I remember when the Marines tried to recruit me in high school. It's like, you have no idea what you're trying to do. Oh, Marine birthday today. Happy birthday, Marines. But we're going to drop the CIA-trained revolutionaries off on the beach at the Bay of Pigs, and they were going to lead a revolution which other people would join as they went to Havana and then overthrow Castro. The U.S. Military would also would supply air support for the operation. When Kennedy looks at the operation, he decides the best plan would be to withdraw the air support, because then it looks like it's a US-led operation. So we drop the 1,500 folks off, 14 or 1,500, and they all get captured or killed. I think a few escape, but most of them get captured or killed. Makes Kennedy look inept, makes the US look weak. The one thing that we were most concerned about Kennedy is that he didn't have enough foreign policy experience, and he might mess that up, and he might have messed that up. So this looks a little bad for Kennedy. Kennedy will give a speech where he'll say, like, I'm not sorry I did it, I'm just sorry it didn't work. And he's also supposed to go to Berlin and have a conference with Khrushchev, a peace conference with Khrushchev. He goes instead and gives a speech at the Brandenburg Gate of in Berlin, the passage from East to West Berlin. And he gives a speech where he says, you know, we're all with you. You know, we are all Berliners, but he tries to say it in German, and he might have said it in a way where it sounded like we are all jelly donuts, but it kind of depends on whose interpretation of that you like. But people understood what he's trying to say, so they were inspired by it. He also announced at that speech that we were going to spend several billion more dollars on defense than we had planned. And then Khrushchev says, what the heck? Why am I even meeting with you? So he cancels the meeting and builds a wall instead. So there you go. Kennedy also wants to improve the United States image throughout the world, so he creates, his administration creates the Peace Corps. Notice that Corps is spelled C-O-R-P-S. I just want to point that out. We've had presidents who weren't aware of that in the past. Do you ever pay attention to presidential speeches? I think because of what I do for a living. The president he went to West Point and kept talking about the Army Corps when he talked about the Army Corps. That was, you're gonna be surprised by this, that was Barack Obama. so I mean, you know, we all, even Obama, who's clearly, and I am not saying that Trump isn't an intelligent man, it's just speech patterns aren't quite as reflective of that, but he's not as good, as polished a public speaker is what I'm trying to say. Although he's not bad with a prepared speech, as long as he stays on script. But yeah, corpse. I remember that he kept talking about the Army corpsmen. It's like, no, corpsmen. But anyway, and George Bush did it all the time, but we expected that from George Bush because, you know, that's what he did. His dad was kind of the same way. All right, back to this. So sorry. So U.S. Peace Corps, that's where we send the college kids, usually recent college graduates throughout the world, to do good things like help with schools or medical clinics, or to help, you know, create a clean water system. Alliance for Progress is the business version of that. So we'd have big corporations that would maybe send equipment or technology to certain countries so that they could create a water system or an electrical grid or build a hospital, that sort of thing. So this is like building big stuff, and Peace Corps is more individuals who help do good things. So this is building good things and doing good things. We want to do this to improve our image throughout the world. So these are primarily to developing nations, certainly what they would have considered in that era third world nations. So nations without as formal a modern economy as we have. All right, Cuban Missile Crisis, a year later, we send the U-2 spy planes over Cuba, which happens a lot. It's part of the reason that the peace conference was with JFK rather than Eisenhower, because we sent the U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union, and one of them got shot down. That was the whole Francis Gary Powers thing. And so Khrushchev said, I'm not meeting with you, Eisenhower, because he thought also maybe he'd get something over on the new guy, which it looked like he did in Bay of Pigs. So Cuban Missile Crisis, when we have this problem, JFK knows he can't look weak on this one. So we send the U-2 spy plane over Cuba. We notice that they are building nuclear missile pads, launch pads, in Cuba, which is about 90 miles from Florida. So this is not ideal. So JFK could call them, he could send them a telegram, there are other things he could do, but instead he goes on television and says, this is what we've seen. And if the Soviet Union doesn't immediately take these out of Cuba, we will respond with the full force of the US military, which everybody knows means nuclear war. So then the Soviet Union said, he is trying to cause thermonuclear war. He's a reckless man. And so the Soviet Union sends their military toward Cuba. So you've got the nuclear subs, you've got the Soviet Navy, the US Navy, all going to Cuba. And what you notice is, if you're Cuba, is that both sides are willing to blow you up to prove their point. So this will change the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev a little bit as well. But the conflict lasts, or the crisis lasts, for about 13 days. This is not about it, lasts for 13 days. There's a book called 13 Days, which they made into a movie called 13 Days, and it's about these 13 days. So it lasted 13 days. This is probably the closest we ever got to nuclear war. They will continue to argue with each other publicly. They're going to negotiate behind the scenes. What the Soviet Union will ask for pretty quickly is for the United States to withdraw their missiles from Turkey. Then we will say we don't have any missiles in Turkey, and then they will show us pictures of our missiles in Turkey, and then we will say those are not our missiles in Turkey, those are NATO's missiles in Turkey, and then they'll go like, same thing. And then we will tell them, look, we will take our missiles, which we're not going to admit that we have, out of Turkey, and will never publicly acknowledge it. However, you will take your missiles out of Cuba, and you will very publicly acknowledge that. And the Soviet Union said, that's cool, we'll do that, but you have to promise you'll never invade Cuba again. And they go like, yeah, that's cool, we're not going to do that. So publicly, it makes it look like JFK forced Khrushchev to back down. So this is very good for JFK. If you're concerned that it's bad for Khrushchev in the press, remember where he's from. So since he's from the Soviet Union, the press is controlled by the government. So they're not going to print anything he doesn't want printed. Now, some of you are going to look, but what about international press? Like, yeah, they're not letting that stuff in. So their media is very tightly controlled. And of course, this is 62, so there's no internet. And, you know, the TV signals are the ones that your country wants you to get. So, you know, their media is not open. So Khrushchev doesn't have the same worries that Kennedy had. So Khrushchev is fine with this. This makes Kennedy look a little tougher. If you're wondering, does this help the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union? The big change is that we put in a direct line of communication, a hot phone or a red phone or something like that. They have different nicknames for it. I know when I was a kid, I heard about it, I thought it was like the bat phone, but it's not really a bat phone. Is that a reference that works for you? But it's direct line of communication between the head of the Soviet government and the head of the US government. So that way, if they wanted to threaten each other, they could just pick up the phone and do it. They wouldn't have to have a press conference. So it made the public relationship probably a little more peaceful. The private, behind the scenes relationship probably wasn't any better. But at least we didn't go on TV and threaten and nuke each other quite as often. Okay, we never did that. All right, and then if you're wondering, was Kennedy good with civil rights? I'm going to go with mostly no. He looked like he might be, but he also had the same problem that Democrats have in that era. In the North, the cities vote for them. In the South, in this era, the Klan members still voted for them. So in the South, your constituents want segregation. So you pushing very hard for civil rights means you're going to lose the South. And the Democrats knew they couldn't win the election if they lost the KKK vote, which is a tough position to be in, isn't it? Yeah. And I know some of you are going like, well, why was that even valuable? Their thought was if they didn't win the election, they couldn't make a change. Now, I know, Truman put civil rights into the platform, which was problematic. I mean, you saw Strom Thurmond run, but you'll also see George Wallace run. And George Wallace gets elected governor right about the same time. I think it is the same year. I'm sorry that I didn't look that up before, but I think it's the same year or 2 years before JFK's election. So they've already integrated Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, and that took the National Guard and caused property damage and people get shot. And that was to get one black guy, James Meredith, into a university with tens of thousands of white guys. So the next university they're going to integrate is University of Alabama. And you've seen this in Forrest Gump, which, as I've mentioned to you before, is not terribly accurate, but a little accurate. Forrest Gump wasn't real. But the University of Alabama being integrated is what you see where the one student drops her notebook and Forrest Gump picks that up. Well, that whole scene in real life, not the Forrest Gump version, is also a photo event. It's a photo op. The federal government has made a deal with George Wallace, and they said, we're going to integrate your university, but we don't want to blow it up. And Wallace says, that's cool. Well, we really don't want to blow it up. He said, but I've promised my people that I am going to fight the federal government if they want to integrate the school, the university. So you have to allow me to oppose you, and we need pictures of it. Okay, I'm not trying to diss Forrest Gump. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to diss Forrest Gump. But George Wallace, also a real guy, not based on a real guy, also a real guy, says, he makes a deal with the JFK administration that they will let him have his photo op where he's spread across the door and they're pointing their bayonets at him. And he's saying, you will not enter this university. And if you look, there are a couple of people who take the full picture, and I think you can find it online, but you can see him and he's posed, and there are all the guys with the bayonets pointing at him. And then behind him, there are hundreds of photographers, if you pan out on the photo, and they're all just snapping photos of that. So it's completely staged. But that's what they felt like they had to do. They had to make a deal with the segregationist governor to peacefully integrate the university. Now, people within the Kennedy administration, including Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, thought that JFK was being too tentative, that he needed to push harder. He eventually will, but it's after Martin Luther King Jr.'s arrest and the letter from the Birmingham jail, and then after Medgar Evers, who's the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, gets shot in his driveway in front of his wife and kids, which is an incredibly tragic moment because he's organizing a voting rights drive. So after all of that stuff happens, I think it's either the day of or the day after Medgar Evers is assassinated, then JFK gives a speech where he says, you know what, civil rights is no longer a black and white issue. It's not a Southern issue. It's not even an American issue. It's a human issue, and we have to take care of it now. So he says that in the summer of '63 and is assassinated in November of '63. Now, I would not suggest to you that those things are connected. I don't think that they are, but the truth is there's so much conspiracy about JFK's assassination that, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. All right, let me stop sharing. Some of you are going like, yeah, you need to stop sharing, but I meant the screen. So I've got to double check the roll before we go. Do you guys have any questions before I stop recording? No. Anything you guys want to ask really quick? All right, I am going to stop recording, but don't go just yet, okay?